Good afternoon, bonjour, and welcome to the Graduate Institute's lunch briefing on the US election. I have the pleasure to moderate this event today. My name is Christine Lutranger from the Graduate Institute's Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy, and I'm very happy to introduce my colleague, Professor David Sylvan, who is our host today. David Sylvan is professor at the Graduate Institute Department of International Relations, Political Science. He is a specialist on foreign policy analysis, political economy, and methodology. His current research projects concern national security and how news and media interpret policy announcements by state agencies. He, among many publications, he recently co-authored a book entitled US Foreign Policy in Perspective. So we are really at the heart of our topic today for this lunch briefing on the US election. In this actually very extraordinary time for the world, the US election may also be one of the most important elections in recent times, which have implications much beyond the US. At this lunch briefing, we will discuss those implications with David Sylvan. And as probably you already know the format of those events, we will start with a presentation of our speaker for about 20 to 25 minutes. And David will provide us with a first tour d'horizon on the trends for the presidential race and the two House of Congress. He will also engage in a discussion on the different scenarios for policy making, and this will open the debate with the audience. So welcome to all of you who are joining us either from Geneva, from the Institute, but from many other parts of the world probably as well. And we noticed that those online events also provide the opportunity to colleagues and also alumni to join us for discussion. So you will have the possibility to ask your questions by using the Q&A chat, which is located on the right-hand side of the screen. So you can start already during the presentation to write your questions. If you wish to do so, you can also indicate to us from where you are joining this debate. And I will read out the questions and also your names in the second part of this event to engage with in a discussion with David Sylvan. So this event is also recorded and will be made available online on the Grad Institute's YouTube channel. I think this is for the short introduction, and with no further ado, I would invite David to start with his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Christine. That's very kind of you. And I want to say that I'm pleased to be here. When I first moved to Geneva many years ago, and people would ask me to do things about US elections, I would say indignantly, well, I'm not a specialist in American politics. I don't do elections. I do international relations. And nobody cared. And so now it's become a once every 4-year opportunity for me to revisit some of the types of things that I studied years ago and to keep up actually with literature that I don't usually look at. This particular election, as Christine mentioned, is especially important. There are a lot of colleagues of mine and a lot of people generally who are saying that it may be the most important election in over 100 years, at least for the United States, and has implications, it seems to me, for the entire world. I also know lots of people who have been waking up with nightmares. I think of the famous James Joyce comment on that. And I would simply say that what I'm going to try to do is to give some of the most recent bits of information here. I got burned very badly 4 years ago when I tried to make a prediction because the prediction turned out to be ludicrously inaccurate. My defense is that almost everybody else was inaccurate, but that's not really much of an excuse. So with that in mind, let me just give an overview of what I'm going to be doing here. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to start start the slideshow here. What I'm interested in doing basically is to demonstrate, is to talk about several different issues. One, which is the issue of trends, and then after I talk about trends, I'll be talking about scenarios. So let me start out, if I could, by talking about trends. And I want to go over a variety of issues, kind of a bit more theoretical issue about the role of what's called turnout, that is when people actually turn out to vote, to talk about what happened in 2016 and why various people, including me, got it so wrong, and then to talk about how those trends have been updated about turnout and more generally the implications for forecasts about what's going on now. So to start out, and this is something that I try to point out to people all the time, but it's the kind of thing that most of us actually don't know about because it's not the way that the news media present things. And that is very simply that elections are not won or lost by getting voters to switch sides or by convincing people who are unconvinced. Yes, there are a handful of people who might actually be susceptible to appeals like that. But in most countries, including Switzerland, and in most elections, it's not a question of actually providing ammunition or arguments one way or the other. It's a question simply of actually, as I said, one, you win by turning out your partisans, the people who are already leaning toward you. You win by getting them to vote, and also by discouraging those on the other side from turning out, that is, from voting. And both of those are important, okay? From the standpoint of a political party or a candidate, a vote is a vote. And the idea is that if you can get your people to vote for you and you can discourage the people on the other side from voting against you, you're more likely to win. And so that's what campaigns are really about. The role of advertisements, the role of debates, the role of so-called red meat issues. For example, the haste with which the Republicans, the last few weeks, pushed forward this nomination and confirmation of a new Supreme Court justice. It's not just that they were worried that they might lose. It was seen, and the head of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, was very clear about this. It was seen as a way to motivate their voters to actually go vote, to say, look what we're doing, you can get excited. And they were actually disappointed that the Democrats didn't fight more harshly about this. They wanted a big fight so they could get their voters really upset with the Democrats and get them to go to the polls. And also what this implies, and is very significant, is attempts at voter suppression. Now, I assume that many people in the audience have actually been following the really sordid stories in the United States over the last few months about the various ways to suppress the vote. So who can vote? Okay, there are all kinds of restrictions in the United States. People are not registered to vote automatically as they are, for example, in Switzerland. There are also restrictions on the kinds of identification one has to show, on signatures, on other kinds of things like this. So the attempt is, and this goes back to the 19th century, is consistent to try to make sure that some people don't vote, the people who you don't want to vote. There's a question of when voting occurs, okay? In many parts of the United States, until relatively recently, it was very difficult to vote by mail. Now it's become easier because of legislation and policies that have been adopted since the COVID pandemic. But the point is that in many cases, one actually had to have affidavits and one had to have all kinds of multiple signatures to be permitted on rare occasions to vote by correspondence. Moreover, the hours of the voting are very, very restricted in many cases in the United States. The election takes place on a Tuesday, which is a work day, and not on a Sunday. It's not a holiday. And people don't get off from work unpaid or on a paid basis to be able to go vote. The hours that polls are open vary massively from one municipality in one state to another. And then finally, even where polling places take place, where they're actually located. And in some cases, people have to go a long way to vote. You've all seen, for example, pictures like this, which show, it seems to me quite graphically, just how disorganized and how backward many parts of the United States are. And in fact, this is a standard paradox. Anyone who studies the United States knows that in certain respects, it's almost painfully cutting edge. and in other respects, it's incredibly backward. And this is one of the respects in which it seems to me is actually deliberately backward. People can wait literally for hours. There's actually websites that talk about the kind of folding lawn chairs that one should bring if one actually has to go in and wait in line to vote. So that's just a point that I want to make, which is the significance of turnout and how everything in the election depends on that. Now, let's take a look at the year 2016. And I want to start off by just looking at the United States in comparison with other states. So at least as of a few years ago, looking at the last general election, this is not the most up to date. The Belgians have the current champions with 87% of the voting age population actually voting. Okay, if you go down through the 70s, you go down through the 60s, and eventually you arrive, as you see, at the United States with 55.7% voting. Now that's a bit misleading, as I'll talk about in a moment. And for those of you interested in Switzerland, in terms of the federal elections, and this is out of date, we've had a new one now, it's an even lower percentage there, okay? So the United States, you basically have, if you put all the elections together, a little over half of the population voting. Now, if you look at what happened in 2016, and this is actually the reason that the polls were so off. If you look at this particular table, what you see is that between 2012, which is when Obama was running for his second term, and 2016, when Hillary Clinton was running against Donald Trump, you had an increase in white, non-college, that is non-university educated voters of 3%. That's a very significant increase, okay? In a country of hundreds of millions of people. That's an incredibly significant increase, and it jives anecdotally with all the stories we heard about rural voters and small town voters coming out in droves to vote for Trump, people who had never voted before or hadn't voted in a long time. On the other hand, what's striking is that the increase in white college educated was nowhere near as big, and there was a notable decline in African American votes. And again, with 2020 hindsight, that makes perfect sense. Obama was not running in 2016. He had been running in 2012. You put those two numbers together, the decline in 4.5% of the African American vote in terms of turnout, and the increase of 3% in the white non-college educated vote. And that's exactly how Donald Trump was able to eke out these tiny little election victories in these upper Midwestern states, the states that actually gave him the keys to the White House. Because again, remember, the United States does not have a national election in the sense of a popular vote, as in, let's say, France. The United States has 50 separate state elections, and it has a particularly weird rule in which if one candidate gets a single vote more than the other candidates in a given state, even if he's nowhere near 50%, he gets all the electoral votes of that state. So this tells you right here, this graph, it seems to me, shows exactly what's at stake and why the parties and the candidates spend so much of their campaign trying to get their partisans to turn out, and at least with regard to the Republicans, why they spend so much time in trying to make it hard for people who are on the other side to turn out. Now, if we turn to 2020, overall, this is the United States. This is eligible voters. And what we're looking at here is the turnout rates from the very beginning of the Republic in 1789, the very first presidential election, the one with George Washington running for the first time, those interested, up through 2018. And you see two things going on. You see on the one hand that presidential elections in general, people vote at a much higher rate than they do in so-called midterm elections. That is, elections like 2018 and 2014 and 2010 and so forth, okay? There's someone on the ballot for president and therefore people vote, and that's very, very significant difference there. You'll notice that from the late 1800s or the beginning of 1900 to the present, there was a decline, a very significant decline in turnout rates. And then it jumped up a little bit with the enfranchisement of women in the 1920s. And then again, it's kind of drifted to a lower level there. But I would like to just call your attention to this last little dot in orange, which is the 2018 election, the midterms. This was the election where the Democrats retook control of the House of Representatives. It was a disavowal to a great degree of Donald Trump, and one has, again, anecdotally, stories of people waiting hours and hours in freezing rain, remember it's early November, to be able to have the pleasure of voting symbolically, at least, against Trump. So that's a straw in the wind about what might happen now. If we look at a second example here, the so-called youth vote, youth defined here arbitrarily as people aged 18 to 29. Now, what's going on is that if you study politics in most countries, you find that young people, people in that age category, vote at relatively low rates. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that forecasting is so difficult. If a voter says that he or she is planning on voting, and you interview the person or you poll the person maybe a week ahead, 2 weeks ahead, 3 weeks ahead, you don't know if that person's going to vote. You have no way of knowing. And so if you're running a polling organization, you have to apply a kind of turnout multiplier, and that multiplier has to be historical. So if someone who's, let's say, 19 years old says that she's going to vote, you would say, well, the chances are statistically it's not that high. Whereas if it's a person who's 65 or 70 years old, the chances, you would say, are much higher. The same thing with regard to issues of race and so forth. So that we're dealing here with a component of votes that actually statistically is very strongly in favor of the Democrats, but that they don't actually go to the polls and vote. If you look at this particular graphic, you see that, in fact, the early evidence in terms of people voting early is a massive increase compared to what was before. Now, that's the case actually across the board, but particularly for young people, that actually suggests something very interesting. It mirrors to some degree what we saw in 2018. It suggests that this time around, Democratic partisans are incredibly motivated and they will actually go to the polls. Whether that happens, we'll actually have to wait and see. Now, if I turn to the issue of current forecasts, I'm going to give you forecasts from several different places here, and I'm not endorsing any of them in particular. But Larry Sabato, who is at the University of Virginia, has been running a very respected website and kind of polling center for a number of years now. And as of a few days ago, Sabato's, this is the University of Virginia Center for Politics, actually shows this particular map, which is to say you need 200, you have 435 votes. Okay, so what you need is, you need 270 to be able to win the presidency. The current forecast, if the election were to held today and all of the polls were to actually be accurate, which of course they won't be, the Democrats would win easily. They would already have more than the 270 needed. They would have 290, and there would be 85 electoral votes that would be toss-ups, notably in places like Iowa, like Ohio, North Carolina, and so forth. So that's one forecast. That's a forecast that says if you were to take both current voting intentions and adjusted turnout rates, that Biden would likely win. A second example comes from the website 538.com that some of you undoubtedly know about. I couldn't get a graphic for today or for yesterday. So this is one from a few days ago. The current simulations is not 12, Trump wins 12 in 100, but 11 in 100. Okay, that is every time they do 100 simulations, and you see they simulated 40,000 times. They change the parameters on different states and so forth. And of the 100 times, basically Biden's winning now in 88 out of 100 of the simulations. Now, of course, that doesn't prove anything. And I and many other people will continue to be nervous up until the end. Okay, but it does suggest, if you go along with the thing with Sabato, that it's increasingly going to be difficult for Trump to make this up. Okay, about the Senate. I've been telling people for months and months and months that the serious issue for my concern is not the presidency, although that's obviously of paramount importance, but the Senate, because the Senate is the body that actually blocked much of what Obama wanted to do, including actually naming and nominating Supreme Court justices and so forth. And it's very clear that if the Republicans continue to control the Senate, that even if Biden is president and will be able to do some things, he'll be blocked. So now the question is what's going on there. The current forecast, again from Sabato, is that if the election were held today, the Democrats would get exactly half the seats. They would get 50. The Republicans would get 49. There's one toss-up, which is North Carolina. And under the current rules, if Biden wins the presidency, this would mean that his vice president, Kamala Harris, would preside over the Senate and be a tie-breaking vote. So that's potentially significant. A second example, again from the 538 website, is that there's an awful lot of blue here, okay? And so you can see that, in fact, it looks like, again, the odds are in favor of the Democrats picking up a majority of the Senate, but this is much iffier. And one of the reasons it's iffier is that the level of accuracy of polling for individual states is much less than for the country as a whole. And there are some states that people just don't poll as much. Okay, let me turn quickly to the House of Representatives. So as I said, you need 270 votes to win the presidency. What you need to win control of the House is 218. The current estimate is that the Democrats will easily hold on to their House majority. Okay, they get 231 if the election were held today, and the odds are they will pick some additional ones up. So it seems to me that the Republicans, it's the chances that they will be able to retake the House are relatively minimal. Finally, let me simply say a quick word about state legislatures, which strikes, I'm sure, many of you as the single most boring topic you could imagine. But in fact, it's in the state legislatures that districts are actually specified geographically. And so there's a new census that's just finishing right now. And every single state that's had population change, which is to say almost every state, will therefore have to redistrict and have to decide if there's more than one congressional representative in the state, where the boundaries of that district are. And you all heard of the phrase like gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is obviously significant. It's a way of actually cutting up the district, of drawing the boundaries in such a way as to maximize for your party the number of districts that you can send people to Congress. If you look at this, there's an awful lot of seats that are up for grabs, depending on what happens. So that one of the major kind of trench warfare aspects of this election will be in votes that voters cast for who their local state representative is, who goes to the legislature in the capital, let's say in Albany in New York State, or in Sacramento in California, or in Springfield in Illinois, because those are the people who will decide on the composition of Congress for the next 10 years. Now, at this point, let me stop talking about forecasts. I'm sure there will be questions in the Q&A, and let me finish up by just going over three scenarios. The first, and I'll take a deep breath, is if Trump wins. The second is if Biden wins and the Democrats lose the Senate. And the third is if Biden wins, and the Democrats win the Senate. So if Trump wins, domestically, he will have obviously complete control over the judiciary and bureaucracy. I've been stunned because the control of the bureaucracy is much greater and much more comprehensive than I would have expected. They have already put in huge numbers of people in the judiciary. There will clearly be an acceleration of moves toward a dual society, racially, economically, policing, and so on and so forth. Internationally, it's clear there will be continued attacks on international organizations. And what concerns me most, both as a citizen and as a political scientist, is encouragement around the world of xenophobia and authoritarianism. This will be a very severe blow to the likelihood of democracy continuing in any number of countries around the world. Second scenario, if Biden wins and Democrats lose the Senate, I would expect some move to the status quo ante, especially as regards the bureaucracy. Okay, obviously Biden will get rid of most of the Trump loyalists. And internationally, I'm sure he will rejoin certain kind of organizations and try to restore funding. I expect continued blockage on the judiciary. I would expect that if the Republicans control the Senate, they will systematically block Biden nominating any judge. I expect massive underspending on health and everything else, because now that they will be out of power, the Republicans will all of a sudden rediscover that they're actually in favor of fiscal conservatism. And I expect a sharpening of racial tensions. They will be going after Kamala Harris, because we're dealing here with another person who is non-white, okay? And already what we saw under Obama will be just a foretaste of this. Finally, if Biden wins and Democrats win the Senate, I expect a partial restoration of the status quo ante in both policy and personnel terms, both domestically and internationally. I expect that Biden will roll back many of the more retrograde policies that Trump carried out, whether it's on the environment or on immigration or other kinds of things. I expect, as I said again, that he will try to rejoin the WHO, stop attacking NATO, and so forth. There will be a move forward on some reforms. If the Democrats win the Senate, and if they stop filibusters, I'm sure that they will be able to pass new legislation about health reform, about health insurance. They will be able to do some things about climate change, and there will be some changes on racial issues, although racial issues in many cases are dealt with at the level of states and localities. But, and I want to finish on this highly encouraging note, there will probably be a very strong pushback and likely a new battle in the Republican Party in the year 2022, because getting rid of Trump does not mean getting rid of Trumpism. And there's an awful lot of senators and some congressional representatives who have signed on to this and will decide that this is a winning battle. And if they can come up with a candidate who's less personally abrasive than Trump, that they may be able to recapture the White House. So I would expect that, to use the ancient Russian term, it's going to be a time of troubles for the Republicans in any case, one way or the other. That's basically all that I had. And at this point, let me simply give the mic back to Christine and try to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, David, for this very clear, interesting, and thought-provoking presentation as well in terms of the democratic processes that are involved in the current elections, which are not specific to the election, but which help us to understand also how to make sense of the results, and also especially how important the turnout will prove to be. And I'm glad to see that we have 160 participants who have joined us. And please feel free to type in, write in your questions. And before I start with the first questions from the audience, I would like to ask you, David, in the perspective of, in a way, disentangling the short-term issues, concerns related to the current election, but also deriving from this 4-year of the Trump presidency, from longer-term processes. So I would like to start with a very direct and provocative question about the stakes of this election. Do you see American democracy at risk? And in terms of the institutions, the mechanisms, and the democratic norms that have been underpinning the functioning of the American democracy so far?
The short answer is yes. The reason I see it as risk is that the countervailing powers that the U.S. Constitution gives, above all to the Congress and to a lesser degree to other parts of the U.S. government, for example, the courts, and then indirectly, because it's a federal system, to the states and so forth, those countervailing powers have been massively weakened. What the Republicans have understood is that Trump was not only useful to them in terms of getting the things done that they wanted to get done, namely cutting taxes for wealthy people and putting lots and lots of right-wing judges on different courts. Those were their two top priorities, and McConnell has been very, very clear about that. But that Trump also actually offered them the possibility of doing things that nobody would have thought of doing before. So take, for example, something as, on the one hand, stupid, but also as symbolic as his famous wall with Mexico. So you remember he tried over and over to get Congress to vote money for the wall, and Congress basically didn't give him any money. So what Trump then decided to do was, simply in violation of certainly some laws and of many, many norms, is to take money that had been allocated and voted legally for other purposes, other parts of the U.S. government, and simply spend the money on that. In the past, if any prior president had done this, the Congress would have immediately revolted, and they would have passed legislation over his veto, and they might well have actually threatened to impeach him. In this particular case, it became an ideological issue. And one of the things that's striking, therefore, is that the Republicans have, in a very differential fashion, the Democrats haven't done this, they've actually moved to support Trump in terms of violations of the rule of law. I suspect that one of the reasons they did this is that the fear that most politicians in most countries have that keeps them in line, which is, okay, what happens when we're out of power? Okay, we want to try to treat our opponents in at least marginally decent fashion because one day they'll be in charge and we won't be. They've begun to actually explore the possibility that maybe with gerrymandering and maybe with courts controlling who votes and maybe with the kind of echo chamber that's the right-wing media and so forth, they may never actually have to face that again, right? And so that, it seems to me, is one of the lessons that was learned. So in my view, American democracy resided to an incredible degree on a certain set of institutions. I wouldn't say necessarily shared norms, but a certain set of institutions. We used to think when I was in graduate school, and even up until about 20 years ago, that those institutions were underpinned by norms. It's beginning to dawn on me that those norms may not be as broadly shared, and I could give you analogous stories for a number of other countries as well, and that's what's particularly worrisome.
Thank you, David. And let me take the first question from Dale Honeck, who is asking whether the winner-take-all rule whether it can be replaced with proportional allocation of electors, the first step in eliminating the electoral college.
Not immediately, but I think we're slowly moving in that direction. There has been a move afoot, and it's not far from being successful now, where a number of states have actually passed legislation saying that once a certain number of states, they're not there yet, get to a certain point, that they will allocate all of their electoral votes to whomever wins the popular vote. So this is a kind of indirect way through the federal system to eliminate the electoral college. There are, I believe, 2 states, Nebraska and Maine, that do not allocate winner take all, but actually will separate out who wins the electoral vote depending on the district. Up until now, politicians have been very reluctant to change that because they see it as a kind of prime. They see it as a kind of present that they get for winning a particular state. But it seems to me that the more it happens that, in fact, that huge numbers of people who may be on the losing side, but not by very much, are upset, then in fact, this could actually lead to some changes. Up until now, because of the Florida election in the year 2000 and because of what happened last time around in 2016, it's the Democrats who've been on the kind of complaining side. If it turns out that this time that you get a whole bunch of Republican voters who are disgruntled, it's possible that they will want to change things. I'm very dubious, okay? The Congress is where good ideas go to die, but it's possible that this might happen.
Sophia is asking, what are toss-ups?
A toss-up is something where we're, in terms of the specific states, where we don't know what's going to happen. There are several states that are very, very much up in the air. If you just look at, again, the 538.com website, you'll get the latest information on states where the polling shows the 2 candidates so close that they could flip in either direction. So, for example, Iowa or North Carolina could easily go for either candidate. It just depends, as I said, to a great degree on turnout. So there are some states where you actually have to toss a coin. I mean, we can't make any reasonable predictions. We're in what Donald Rumsfeld used to call unknown unknowns. There are other places you can be quite sure what's going to happen. There's no way in hell that California will not vote for Biden, that Illinois will not vote for Biden, that New York State will not vote for Biden. And there's almost no way in hell that a place like Alabama or West Virginia or Oklahoma will not vote for Trump. Okay, so there are some states that are the antithesis of toss-ups and others that are really, really up in the air. And that's a little bit different than what we call swing states, if you want to be technical about it, because a swing state is a state that literally can swing back and forth from election to election. Some of the states that I'm mentioning don't swing very much, but in this particular election, things are quite different.
And Michael is asking whether there has been any exit polling of the 70 million plus early voters, of which he is one.
Well, good for him for voting early. But no, there can't be exit voting because in almost all cases, this is done by This is done by ballot. Okay, so the normal idea of an exit poll is that you station some people, usually college students or graduate students, outside of polling places a certain distance away, as required by law. And then when voters emerge, you say, whom did you vote for? In this case, there's no place to emerge from. Now, there have been polls asking people if they've already voted, and people do respond to those polls. And I don't think that they're necessarily lying, but if I were a pollster, I would take this all with a grain of salt. So, for example, I was reading just today that in the state of Wisconsin, that 90% of the people who were polled say they're intending to vote. I don't think Wisconsin has voted 90% ever in its entire history. It's in the 70s, which is incredibly high by US standards. The idea that 9 out of 10 eligible voters would actually go to the polls is a kind of civics fantasy. So that's a way of saying that I think we need to take all of these polls about people's intentions to vote, and even the question, did you vote already, with a grain of salt. As I said, it's not because people are lying, it's because they have good intentions, and like most of us, we don't always act on our intentions.
Right. Mariana is asking whether, do you think there is a chance that Trump wins and Democrats get the majority in the Senate?
I think that's extremely unlikely. Of course, having said that, God knows if it'll happen, right? But I think it's extremely unlikely because the polling in the case of Trump is very, very clear, whereas in the case of the Senate, it's much less clear. Trump runs behind senators in a number of places, and so what that means is that it's absolutely possible for a particular senator who's Republican to be reelected even though Trump loses the state. The reverse is extremely unlikely. What it would mean is that a senator is massively unpopular, but Trump is popular. There are 1 or 2 senators who are massively unpopular. There's no doubt about that. There's some people who profited financially from the pandemic. There's others who have been particularly insulting of their constituents and so forth. But in general, that just doesn't happen. The head of the ticket usually sweeps people in with him, or if the head of the ticket doesn't win, they're not swept in. But usually people's fate is tied to the president. That's why, by the way, the Republicans are so desperately concerned, because they would have thought up until 6 months ago that they had a lock on the Senate. That if you looked at the places that they were battling in, that they were likely to hold on to almost all their seats and pick up a seat as well in Alabama.
Thank you, David. Let me now take a few questions on the U.S. Foreign policy. So we have Victoria Campaniu from the law school from Bucharest University asking whether there is a chance that the stance of the U.S. will change if Biden wins towards more multilateralism.
Absolutely. There's no doubt whatsoever. Biden is a big fan of a number of multilateral organizations. He's been going to meetings connected with NATO since the 1970s, and certainly he will try to strengthen that. He has positive feelings about the United Nations. He has positive feelings about the EU. He certainly does not want to withdraw from the WHO. So I think almost across the board, he's going to be very, very supportive. And I think that the same thing will happen also even with things like the WTO. So I would be astonished if Biden doesn't do that. That's what we call low-hanging fruit. That's one of the easiest things to do is just reverse this.
Thank you, David. And a connected question from Xiao Quan, who is asking for your views on trends of US-China relationships.
Right. Now, this is an interesting question, and it's actually a lot more complicated because if you look at both polling, but especially if you do a kind of analysis of the speeches and the writings of various US elites, as we like to call them, not just politicians, but people who are leaders of in business or of universities or of certain other kind of organizations, U.S. elites have become, like their counterparts, I might add, in a number of European countries. This is not isolated. They become much more skeptical, if not hostile, to China in the last few years. I don't think that has anything to do with Trump. Most of these people were appalled at Trump's tariff wars with China and his embrace of the Chinese president. So it has nothing to do with that. But it seems to me that the bloom is off the rose, if I can use a cliche, and that U.S. elites, as I said, like their counterparts in a number of countries, think about Germany, for example, have really cooled to China. And so I would expect that there will be quite a bit of tension for the next few years there. I think that the elites in a number of countries have now decided that China is not a country that they can actually make a deal with. That's going to have really serious long-term implications. But this is something that it seems to me that there's actually one of the few bipartisan aspects in American politics. If you look at the Senate, the number, for example, of skeptical or hostile comments about China is just about identical, whether we're talking about Democrats or Republicans.
Thank you. And let me pick a question from Carolina, again, around the actions or attitudes of the international community. If Trump loses, do you think that the international community will hold him accountable for things like detention of immigrant families, etc.?
It would be nice, but I wouldn't hold my breath on this one. Lots of leaders do lots of terrible things, and they're very rarely held accountable. I would be delighted if at least he would be held accountable in terms of domestic American politics. I don't even expect that to happen. If you remember when Obama came into office in 2009, there was, of course, the whole quite sordid affair of the torture at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. And people were genuinely shocked at that, and they were expecting Obama, for example, to name some type of blue ribbon commission or a special prosecutor to go into those types of things. He didn't do anything about it, and he said, which I think for a law school professor was really an astonishing statement, "Oh, I don't want to be looking backward. Trials are looking backward," which is like, of course, that's what trials actually do. So there was this sense of trying to go forward. It strikes me that in general, unless there were particularly egregious crimes committed, and there may have been, for example, with regard to immigration or things like this, I would not expect any kind of prosecution, and there certainly will not be any kind of people being shipped off to The Hague. That said, I would expect there to be any number of settling of accounts, okay? Not just that people will get fired and that there will be a complete reversal of policy. I expect that there will be a kind of anathematization, kind of a naming and shaming of any number of elites who actually collaborated with Trump. And I would also imagine that some of the various financial shenanigans that Trump and his people have been engaged in will certainly be the object of criminal investigations. We already see this going on right now in the state of New York, and I would imagine the same kind of thing would happen afterward. I think the interesting question, it's a very minor question, but it's an interesting question, is that if Biden gets elected, will Trump try to step down beforehand so that he could be pardoned by Pence? That's a kind of as they say in the United States, that's an inside baseball type of question. I suspect that he'll be vacillating on this because he certainly wants to avoid prison, but on the other hand, he doesn't actually want to necessarily lose any of his authority up until the absolute last second.
Thank you, David, for this. And let me take Shannon's question. She says, I'm from the US and recently moved here. I'm curious if David could talk more about what concerns folks here in Switzerland, the EU, etc., about this election.
Talk more in the sense of something about...
What is, according to you, the concerns of citizens or the public in Switzerland, in Europe, and...
Okay, it seems to me there are obviously some very specific issues. You think, for example, the WHO and COVID, or you think about NATO, or you think about the EU, you think about Brexit and so forth. But beyond that, it seems to me and of course also issues connected with multilateralism and the United Nations and so forth. But it seems to me that in a sense, that the most significant effect that Trump has actually had on politics in other countries is serving as a kind of almost pole of attraction for authoritarian and xenophobic leaders and parties around the world. Obviously, in Europe, I mean, one thinks of Orban, one thinks of Salvini, one thinks of a number of other groups there that have actually taken Trump very, very seriously. That doesn't mean that there's necessarily a new kind of fourth, or I guess I should say fifth international, headed by people like Steve Bannon, who's likely to end up actually in prison. But rather it has to do with the fact that Trump, there's a kind of invisible party that's become very, very strong. And what's particularly striking is that they read some of the same, they're on the same social media, and they have some of the same kind of conspiracy theories, things like QAnon and 8chan, 4chan, and things like this. And this is quite striking. And so people that I know in Europe, apart from the specific issues, which are important, don't get me wrong, about things like multilateral trade and the pandemic, those are vital issues. But beyond that, it seems to me the really significant thing is that Trump has served as a kind of pole of attraction, as a kind of signal that normalizes behavior that would have been considered completely outside the pale and totally unacceptable even 10, even 8 years ago in many, many countries.
And this leads me to take two questions that are related to the acceptance or not of the results of this election by Donald Trump. So our colleague Ruiz Teves from the Department of International History at the Grad Institute is saying that there has been a lot of speculation about possible scenarios for the current administration to steal the election in a sort of repeat scenario of 2000. How likely do you find this? And Michael, who is asking you, what would a scenario look like where there was a refusal of the Trump administration to accept the results of a peaceful transition of powers? What could a conservative Supreme Court do in this regard?
Well, I mean, I think those are unfortunately both very, very good questions, and they're highly germane right now. What most observers are now saying is that if the election is close, okay, if it looks like it's going to depend on one or two states, and if those states, for example, have ballots that have not been counted for a week or two, and if in those states, moreover, the legislature is controlled by the Republicans, then all kinds of mischief is possible. There was a Supreme Court ruling just yesterday. And the Supreme Court ruling made it very clear. There were 3 justices who actually made it very, very clear that they would like to basically not count any ballots that are received after Election Day. The rule in a number of states is that they don't have to be received by Election Day, they have to be postmarked by Election Day. One of the things that's very clear that will happen is that the Democrats have been voting massively by correspondence. And so next Tuesday, the likelihood is that the number of voters who will still go to the polls physically to vote on Tuesday are likely in some places to be disproportionately Republican voters, which means you'll have the following nightmare scenario that I'm sure many of you have been reading about, which is that the estimations, the preliminary counts at midnight or at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning Eastern time, which have no legal bearing on anything, they're not official counts at all, will show Trump leading in places like Pennsylvania. We know from what happened just a few months ago in the Pennsylvania primaries that when all the mail-in ballots are counted, that the Democrats will likely come out way, way in front. But I can imagine absolutely Trump, claiming that this is unfair, and he has named enough federal judges that they may be able to issue injunctions, and I wouldn't be surprised at all that this ends up in the Supreme Court. The question is, what will happen then, okay? And it seems to me it really depends to a great degree on people like John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So that's an incredibly pessimistic scenario, that you could have a massive rejection of Trump that ends up, as it were, getting sidelined. However, give a tiny ray of hope here, that kind of scenario is likely only if the stars align, only if a number of other things are the case, which is to say the election is close otherwise, and things are within a certain kind of margin of error. If, as I'm desperately hoping, it's a blowout, and there's some evidence that it may be a blowout, that is a kind of landslide, then it seems to me that's actually much less likely. So we'll just have to wait and see. But this is one of the things that are keeping people up nights. This is one of the things that people are desperately concerned with, because there's no doubt that in some states you have judges who are chomping at the bit, waiting to invalidate a lot of ballots. And indeed, to give you one additional nightmare, which already started happening, it could have happened in Florida in 2000, is that the legislature, if it's controlled by the Republicans, might decide, okay, there's too much ambiguity here. We're just going to pass a law, an emergency law, that will say we will name Republicans to the Electoral College as the Electoral College voters for the state, regardless of what happens, okay? Because they're technically allowed to do this, okay? It's one of the outrageous elements of the U.S. Constitution that the Constitution doesn't actually oblige the Electoral College members to have actually been chosen through an election. They could be chosen by state legislators. It's the case that every state in the United States ties Electoral College choice to the general election, to what the majority of voters actually want. But there's technically no reason that this has to be done. And I can certainly imagine a scenario in which, again, the state of Florida, this is usually where the worst things happen, okay? This is the state of hanging chads and of alligators in people's backyards and so forth. In the state of Florida, I can absolutely imagine that if things look really, really tight, the legislature at that point will pass another piece of legislation. And I can imagine that there are some judges who will actually think that that's okay. So that's why I think everything really depends on not only if Biden gets the majority, but the size of the majority. The larger the majority, the more abashed people will be, and the greater the sense they'll have that this was really be outrageous to try to overturn this. But for many people, they think that they're playing for all the marbles right now, and that's part of the problem.
Thank you. And I'm thinking of also an overall theme which comes up in the question and very much in the comments on the current events and on the past few years, which is about political polarization, which is one of the themes on which we have worked a lot, along with also the role of news media, etc. So let me take two questions that connect with this theme. The first one by Jesper, asking, in scenario one, a Trump win, continued attack on democracy and acceleration towards dual society. What response and from whom, which organizations would you believe the rest of the world ought to give in order to protect democracy? And I had another question related to that, but there are many questions. Thanks to you all for raising so many of them. And sorry if I won't be able to take them all. But there was a question, now I can't see it anymore because there were more questions coming in. It's about the role of the media. Here it is, by Sonia. In terms of stimulating voters to vote for one candidate or another, how big of a role do you think the media plays? Can they really influence the results?
Okay, so let me quickly try to address the first of the two questions you asked. What can be done? There's a lot of things that could be done. I think that we're getting into so far down the road in terms of different scenarios. It's not useful to speculate. I can imagine there would be all kinds of demonstrations. I can imagine that there would be perhaps even sanctions or things like this. But let's cross that bridge when we come to it. We're not there yet, and I would hope that in some sense, good sense would prevail. We may have to revisit that. The other question about the role of media is, it seems to me that the role of media is actually significant, but it's significant in a very asymmetric, a very skewed fashion. If you take a look, for example, in the United States at the so-called standard media, you look at the traditional television networks, you look at CNN and so forth, it gives you kind of news that's down the middle. They will obviously fixate on whatever the topic of the day is, but it doesn't particularly drive things that much one way or the other. Whereas if you look at the right-wing media like Fox News, they don't see themselves as anything other than a propaganda organization. Okay, and so everything every day, and there have been documentaries on this, there have been studies on this every day. The idea is to try to curate things to keep people in a perpetual state of anxiety and anger. And so in that sense, it's something which absolutely is seen there as a way of driving people to the polls. The same thing I might add, if you look at right-wing newspapers in the United States, like the New York Post, this so-called scandal that arose a week or so ago involving Hunter Biden and things like this. This was all ginned up as a way to try to perhaps scare off a few pro-Biden voters, but especially to try to make sure that the people who lean toward Trump would be angry enough to actually go to the polls and vote. And so that, it seems to me, is one of the really important things that's actually done there. And it works, by the way, not just for things like Fox News, which is disproportionately looked at and followed by older voters. Okay, so you have a perfect echo chamber there, right? But also in terms of social media. And this, it seems to me, is one of the things that I think we've now discovered, that the algorithms that are used, especially in places like Facebook, are anything but neutral. And so what we have is a kind of echo effect, echo chamber. And this, again, is happening in countries all over the world. The United States is by no means unique in this regard. And we've had similar kind of catalytic roles of the social media pushing in a xenophobic and authoritarian direction in many, many countries, okay? And again, it's quite different. It does not work the same way for people on the other side of the political spectrum. So this is something, it seems to me, that we actually need to deal with in a really serious way. I think it's a fundamental knife in the heart of our democracy, to be honest with you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Sonia, for this question. And as Sonia, Thomas is an alumnus from the Grad Institute, so thank you for joining us from different parts of the world, I imagine. And I think this will be the last question that we have the time to take. So sure. My apologies for all the other questions that couldn't be addressed directly, although I guess many of them were addressed at least in part. So Thomas is saying that periods of heightened partisanship are not new to US politics. Mm-hmm. How would you compare the current phase of heightened partisanship to previous phases of partisanship in US politics? Further, have periods of heightened partisanship had lasting impacts on the institutional structure of the US polity and its system of checks and balances?
Well, that's a classic political science question. Okay, I feel at home. So I think what we have to do in this case is to distinguish partisanship on the one hand from ideological polarization on the other. Certainly, if you look at the 19th century, elections were dirty. There was massive voting fraud. There was attempts that were clear through violence to intimidate voters or to push people into voting or not into voting, as the case may be. There was, the counting was incredibly corrupt. Okay, bosses would hold back votes and we just add other votes. You have the kind of miracle of the dead people voting and so on and so forth. So it was really corrupt, and this is an era of really high partisanship. Starting in the 20th century, especially from the 1920s onward, it seems to me there was a period which lasted probably about 50 years or maybe 60 years of a relative decline in partisanship, in which the two main parties were actually relatively close to each other. And now that's actually dissolved, and now they're much, much further apart than before. And you can see this in all kinds of ways, okay? And one of the ways in which you can see it is that the parties used to be ideologically extremely heterodox. Even though there was high polarization from a party perspective, they were ideologically heterodox. So the Democrats, on the one hand, included segregationist senators from the South, and they included people who were close to socialists from the urban cities in the North, right? And the Republicans also had a very, very broad range. That's sorted itself out now. And so we have a return to partisanship, which is much greater than before. But one of the reasons we have the return to partisanship is because from an ideological perspective, there's a lot more sorting. It used to be, to put it very simply, that if you knew what someone was in favor of, let's say in terms of taxes, it didn't give you very much predictive value for saying what the person was in favor of in terms of, I don't know, the Cold War or military spending or racial issues and so forth. That is to say, these were, to use political science terminology, these were separate dimensions, okay? Or to use a kind of antique term from sociology, they were cross-cutting cleavages. And now what we see, and this is happening again in lots of countries, it's not just the United States, unfortunately, is that instead of the cleavages being cross-cutting, instead of the different dimensions to politics covering lots of things so that people might feel one way on one issue and a different way on a different issue, they're all aligning in the same direction. It's like taking a bunch of iron filings with a magnet and getting them all to line up. And that, it seems to me, is one of the really, really significant problems. And it's some of the things, it's one of the reasons that we have appeals to violence, and one of the reasons that we have in many, many countries now a sense of winner-take-all politics. And one of the reasons that we have, among other things, this kind of absolute fascination with conspiracy theories about elites and so forth. This is a kind of time of troubles, okay? Or to use the term from WHO, and it's a low dishonest decade, and I'm afraid it's going to actually last for quite a while. So whatever happens in terms of political polarization, we're likely to get ideological polarization that's much worse. And so that's why if Biden is elected, I think it can actually start moving things in a healing direction, but it's going to take a lot of work and it's not going to happen overnight.
Thank you so much, David, for addressing these many questions and for helping us also to understand what is at play and what the different scenarios would entail. So that is one of the several activities organized by the Grad Institute to analyze, to comment on the US elections. And I would like to invite you also to see the interviews that the Institute has recently produced with the Grad Institute's faculty on possible impact of Biden's victory, of Trump's victory, and those videos are available on our website on gradinstitute.ch/US-election-2020. And I also would like to invite you to participate in the online panel discussion that will take place next week together with David Sylvan, which is entitled "The US, a New Age of Reconstruction." And this will take place on Wednesday, 4th of November, from 6:30 to 8 p.m. Swiss time. So thank you to all of you for joining us, and thank you to David for participating in this lunch briefing, and keep in touch with our activities. Have a nice afternoon.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Christine. Thank everybody.
Thank you.